I'd like to thank Gene for prying me out of my safe little office to come here tonight. And I'd also like to thank Mike Flynn for doing such a good job of dressing the presentation up very nicely. And of course, that left me no excuse for staying in my safe little office. So on the one hand, when we talk about the village, the story of Emmaus begins with William Penn and the land given to him by England's King Charles II in payment for a debt owed to William's father, Admiral William Penn. That land would become a haven for people fleeing unrest in Europe and would be called Pennsylvania. On the other hand, the story begins about 10,000 years ago with Native Americans mining jasper in the hills south of Emmaus, now known as South Mountain. The Europeans who settled our area came mostly from Germany. They sailed into the port of Philadelphia and made their way north, partly through what we know today as the Perkiomen Valley, and crossed into the Lehigh Valley through today's Leibert's Gap. And it's likely that as they came through that gap in South Mountain, if they looked to the west, they could have seen fires from the quarries, the jasper quarries. They also had to cross the Ridgetop Trail that the Lenni Lenape used to communicate with the Delaware and Lehigh rivers to transport the things that they made from the jasper. And they may even have stayed a night at Shelter House. Now, Shelter House was probably one of the very earliest dwellings in this area, believed to have been built in 1734. If the original owners were farming, they would have had a tough time of it on that steep slope. But it did last the test of time. And being just a stone's throw from that Ridgetop Trail, it was a clue to the apparent friendly relations between the settlers and the Lenni Lenape. Among the arriving Europeans from Germany were two families who had purchased rather large tracts of land from Penn and his sons. Jacob Ehrenhart came in 1723 as an adult, and Sebastian Knaus came about 16 years later as a child. They would become friends and would both build log cabins for what would become temporary shelter for them and their families. And they would end up traveling together with their wives to Bethlehem to worship in the newly built Moravian church. Bethlehem was settled in 1741. After they're building their own log church here, they eventually offered land to the Bethlehem church in exchange for the church's sponsorship of a new settlement in the area that the Lenni Lenape knew as Magundashe, or translated the feeding place of the bears. There were two tracts of land that you see here that were joined together to create that first village. Now, they were small pieces of much larger tracts that these two men had bought. But you can see, if you would join them, how they would dovetail together. And then they would become the village. And you see in this map that the Moravians had their surveyors draw that combined the two tracts, about 50 or so acres each, into about 100 or 102 acre village. And what you're looking at in this color map is a representation of a village which would have had 32 house lots. It was designed to be a small householders village, not an industrial settlement as the Moravians had conceived for Bethlehem. You had 32 house lots and, a group of field lots surrounding the village that you could lease for farming. Now, you didn't own your lot. Again, the Bethlehem Church, this land was donated to them, and they were what we would call the proprietors. They owned the land, they leased it to you as a householder, and you owned your house, but you didn't own the ground that it sat on. It sounds odd, but it was a system that actually worked very well in the long run. It was a communal effort. They worked together as a village, and it seemed to work for probably almost 100 years. We're not real sure when that Moravian ethic and the hold on the community actually disintegrated, but it would have been sometime before the Civil War. Here's a painting. Rufus Grider was an itinerant painter in the 1740s. And this would have been a painting. You can see that there's South Mountain in the background, and the foreground would have been, right to left, would have been vaguely Main Street. And what you're looking at is a painting of the cemetery. And if you if you look very closely, you can see a gate that goes into the cemetery. What you're not seeing in that painting is the log church, which was positioned in that cemetery very early on in 1742, probably about the first thing these two men did to establish the village proper, or what they hoped would be the village. You don't see it because it had been moved to the church property at the east end of the village, and then eventually it was taken down and replaced again sometime. As the community grew, they, of course, needed a bigger church. And the next painting is done by Nicholas Garrison, probably around 49, 50, 51 in there somewhere, and that's the log church after it had been moved to the church property. The building in the background would have been the schoolhouse. There are different versions artistically of that building, so we don't really know what it looked like, but my guess is it looked exactly like what you're seeing in that painting. Because that painter, Garrison, was hired by the Moravian Church in Bethlehem to paint all 9 Moravian settlements in the state of Pennsylvania. And so this was 1/9 of the total picture. So we'll slip into the colonial era, which in the country's history and also in architecture history, it was a time when things were built by hand. Materials were locally obtained. You didn't have machines to saw lumber. You didn't have electricity to run equipment. What your motive was to put it up as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So you were taking stone, which this house is built of, from South Mountain, and you were using the timber available for the roof framing and for the interior of the house, and also basically in your own backyard. South Mountain provided a lot of material for the community, most of the material for what was built. Now, this is Jacob Ehrenhardt's house. If you would go back and look at that original map of the village, you would see that the lots were numbered. And they were numbered 1 through 32. And number 1 and number 32 were the closest lots to the church. And those were given to Jacob and Sebastian to honor the contribution they made in actually donating the land for the village itself. And that's very colonial. It's actually Georgian, but it's very plain. You would have seen the stone when it was originally built. The dormer wasn't there then. There were some differences, but basically you're looking at a 1760 house. Now, Sebastian's lot was directly across the street in lot number 32, and it's not the best photograph, but if you look a little closely, you can see that it was also stone. Same idea of materials brought down from South Mountain. Sebastian's house is a little more symmetrical, but basically probably a very similar and a more symmetrical floor plan. And then you have down the street, down Main Street, a few doors, you have Michael Knaus. He was one of Jacob's sons. He built his house in 1765. His house, you would have to take the right 3 windows of that house and ignore the fourth one on the left. In my mind, that would have been the original house. Pretty sure that house grew over the years. Again, a stone house, very simple, just a box with what they call a gable roof, no dormers, no front porch, but again, a colonial house. And that house, along with Jacob's house, served as hospitals during the Revolution. That was one of the Moravians' contributions to the war effort. They certainly didn't condone fighting, and they actually threw several members of the community out of the church for signing up and serving. They were very serious about their pacifism, and they're basically non-engaging in government. And then you have Heinrich Knaus, another one of Sebastian's sons, who built what we know today of as the Knaus homestead. It was built for his father, Sebastian, who didn't live to occupy it. And that was built in 1777, and its log, what you see today is clapboard siding, but it was built of logs in what they called corner post construction, which was slightly unusual, but interestingly enough, the same exact construction as that original 1742 log church. And then we have This would have been lot number 33. My guess is that it was the first, and it lines up as lot number 33 on that village map, and my guess is it would have been the first lot that was sold or leased by the Moravian Church outside of that original village plan. This is clearly the 18th century, basically the same house in reverse as Jacob's house, but now you can see stone because they didn't stucco it, or if they did, they took it off. That porch and that interesting gable roof with the columns, that was not original. That's not a colonial detail. You can see how tall the windows are, which is interesting for the colonial era, especially the ground floor. Tall windows, but very small panes of glass. Again, colonial, you were hand making all these things. And the glass probably came from Philadelphia, so you probably had to wait a couple months for that. Here we have Jacob Ehrenhart Jr. Of course, he grew up in the Moravian settlement, went to school there. After he got married, after he came back as a veteran of the Revolutionary War, sometime after that, he built this house in 1803, well, quite a bit after. It's also colonial. It's almost a dead match to his father's house across the street from the church, and I'm pretty sure that's no coincidence. It's the same style, same pattern. It's asymmetrical, but it's very handsome. And we would call this federal now. Of course, it's the same house, but it's a different background. You have people reacting against King George, and rightly so, after the Revolution. And so you don't want to give your house style the name of the king, which you've been so anxious to remove yourself from. The other things that make it federal are just details, but that's a very handsome house. That's now a museum. Of course, there's another view of that from the kitchen side, which was probably the primary entrance to that house, but the front of it is aiming almost exactly at his father's house and the Moravian church in the village, and I don't think that's a coincidence either. I think that was planned. Jacob wasn't in the village, but he was very much connected to it by his family. And then we have a couple more paintings by Rufus Grider. We have one, the same man who did the cemetery painting that we saw previously. This is Jacob's farm. That title block on the bottom that's red is basically Main Street, if you could imagine where you're looking, and you're looking towards South Mountain. So you see the house and the outbuildings, the barn and the outbuildings, which of course are no longer there. And that road to the right, I think, is probably representing 2nd Street, or what would become today's 2nd Street, and it winds around and up through and possibly even over South Mountain through that gap. And then there's another view that Grider painted, which I don't know where it is, but I'm guessing it's at 3rd and Main. Again, now we're looking north because you don't see South Mountain in the picture, and I think that road disappearing to the left is probably today's 3rd Street, which would have been the end of the village, as Jacob and his family knew it. But I couldn't tell you. I'm pretty sure none of those houses really exist anymore. Well, I know they don't. There might be foundations, but there's no house. And then we have, later on in the development of the village, the church has now been replaced. This is probably the 4th church. And it's what you basically see today, but it's only a portion of it. And this is colonial. This is built by hand, stone after stone from South Mountain, timbers from the forest, and high-level carpenters to build that bell tower. And of course, the building on the right would have been the parsonage. After they built that, they built a chapel that connected to the right side of the church as you look at it. And then eventually, as we slip in again to another era, that what we call neoclassical, things are developing, buildings are getting a little more modern, and the church in the 20s is seeing that the community is growing significantly. It was prospering, and they were, I think, in a sense, trying to keep up. Plus, they needed more room, so they added quite a bit of space to the interior of the church, and they also added that portico and rebuilt the entire bell tower. And it's a very handsome building. What you're looking at is basically a Greek temple, and you're starting to see the effects of what we know as the Victorian era and some of the interest in Greek architecture. When you look at that Moravian church, you're looking at things that have been borrowed from ancient Greece. The model for that was almost any Greek temple, but primarily the Parthenon. And the Parthenon gives us a whole bunch of examples of what to do and what not to do, at least for the designers of those buildings. But it also gave the Greeks a real problem. And the problem was that it was so big that a person standing in front of it, looking at it, became somewhat disoriented. There were all kinds of optical illusions happening because of the size and because of all those columns. And what happened was, in that middle image there, if you built the Parthenon perfectly level and perfectly straight up and down, as we would know that as plumb, your eye changed that into making it look as though it was curved upward like a smile. And everything appeared to be tilted out. The columns started to tilt out, but that's normal. That's what your eye does when you're close to something large and tall. But the Greeks knew that, and they started to build and detail and measure things to counteract that. So what they did was, the bottom image, they actually curved the floor, which meant that they had to curve that roof line where the tops of those columns are. And they also tilted all the columns inward to compensate for having them look like they were tilted outward. It's very subtle. It's only a few inches. It's less than 6 inches everywhere. And of course, it changes as you get closer to the middle of the temple. The change is much, much more slight, but you don't see it from the ground. You'll never notice that. But it appears to be perfect to you, and that's the only reason that it does, because it's all been figured out. So today, what we have as a lasting effect of that is really mostly just tapered columns. The columns were tapered to avoid the appearance that they were very narrow in the middle and very fat at the top and bottom. Again, just something that your eye naturally does with something tall and slender. So you can see that if you look at that photograph of the Parthenon. That taper is very obvious. And it was tapered according to a mathematical, basically a calculation. Where did you start the taper and how much did you taper it? All very exact. So we can't talk about Greek temples without talking about Thomas Jefferson, believe it or not. He was very interested in architecture, basically a student of history, a student of architecture, and he liked to think that the ancient Greeks provided a very appropriate model for the architecture of the new nation. And he built his house in Virginia, Monticello, to reflect that. It's basically, the front is basically that Greek temple again. And he had some influence during his presidency over the design of the new government buildings. And if you look at those, the White House and the Capitol building, they all have some very strong Greek elements. And you walk around Washington, you'll see the same thing. It was initially the style to use and became, again, very popular when you look at the Victorian era and the number of, or the importance of Greek revival and these pieces from ancient Greece. It took over for a while. So that brings us to the Victorian era, and what that really meant was, in addition to coinciding with Queen Victoria's reign, the Victorian era was very much influenced by the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and you were having machines created to do all kinds of things that influenced construction and design. You were producing building materials that didn't have to be fashioned from a raw log. They were coming out of these mills ready to cut to length and install. And you had the same thing throughout construction. Finished materials, decorative items on the outside of the building, windows, glass got to be, it was a huge difference in glass making, and you could make larger sheets of glass, you could curve glass, which was a huge boon to design. And so the Victorian era, you were seeing very elaborate designs, and there was a lot more fun involved, really, because people were given a lot of latitude in what they did and what it ended up looking like. So the Victorian era is basically a basket full of different styles. And maybe the most prevalent one was the Greek Revival. And the Historical Society building on Main Street, the Emmaus Historical Society building, is is a really good example of a man who took a tiny portion of the right side of that building, which was one of the original village homes, and expanded it to absorb yet another small home and create basically a Victorian revival or a Greek revival masterpiece. And what makes it Greek? Well, it's that portico, basically, the temple idea, and those tapered columns, and of course the capitals, the top of the column that appears to support the roof. In this case is what they call Corinthian, which is intended to look like acanthus plant leaves. But all that detailing that you're looking at is borrowed right from buildings like the Parthenon, from Greek temples, just used more decoratively than actually structurally. Another really nice example of Greek revival is what used to be called Temperance Hall. It was actually one of the first buildings that was constructed outside of the Moravian village proper that was originally designed, that 32-lot village. This was a little later than that stone house I showed you across from the street, but this was same process by a different man, Dr. Klingman, who renovated that very modest house into this. And he used, the Greek revival ideas, but he used different column capitals. In this case, they're known as Ionic, which are supposed to represent paper scrolls. Very handsome house. One of the next styles in the Victorian era, also very popular, not quite as popular as Greek revival, is Gothic revival. And this is, of course, not local, Iowa, but it's a good representation of Gothic revival. And in homes, the hallmark was that very, very steep gable end of the house facing the front. Very steep roofs, and there was always that front-facing steep, what we call a gable. And, tall windows, larger glass sizes now available. That decoration on the edge of the roof line called the fascia, that's called a barge board. And that was very typical. And the detailing in that varied all over the place, depending on where you were. But again, you could buy that. You didn't have to make it from scratch. You didn't have to carve it. You were buying materials. All those very slender pieces of siding you see on that house, you were buying those from mills or from local suppliers. You didn't have to produce it yourself with a plane and a saw. It was a game changer, all these machines that were now available. Sort of a subtle example on Main Street of Gothic revival is this house. You don't see it in its best form because it's painted. I think if you took the paint off, you'd see a very colorful house. It's brick, but I'm sure there were different colors of brick. But what makes it Gothic revival is that very steep dormer up top. And if you could look more closely at that dormer, you would see the detailing. It's just extraordinary. Now, that would have been fashioned as a whole in a fabricating shop somewhere. But most of those pieces, certainly those spindles, would have been bought probably out of a catalog. The queen of Main Street, as far as Victorian goes, is Dr. Wright's building. Of course, it's Gothic revival because of that, again, that very steep front-facing gable. It had one of those very decorative barge boards at one time that shows up in older photographs, but I'm sure it deteriorated. And in spite of that, these owners are somehow keeping up with maintaining this building. Very amazing detail. And it's just a stunning building. And when you look at those front windows, the first floor windows are so tall, those windowsills are at the floor level. So you're walking out of those windows potentially. Thomas Jefferson did that with his house at a much earlier time when he was paying a fortune and waiting months for glass. But all that detail, you could buy that. That was all available basically off the rack, so to speak. One of the more interesting examples of this Gothic revival, again, there's that very steep, of course it's cut off in the photograph, but that very steep gable at the front, but it's still very richly Victorian. The porch, the decorative work on the porch roof, there's decorative work that you can't see that's in the cornice, which is under the main roof. Very, very handsome building. The Hawman house. Hawman was a cigar maker, and his factory was on South 2nd Street, right behind what today is Hendricks Service Station. It's a very, very nice example of Gothic revival. And these things are very difficult to maintain and to keep that history alive. And sometimes progress just goes in a different direction. And in this case, progress went towards Tudor. And I'm guessing this would have been in the, 1960s. And it's a little bit of a shame. Didn't do the building any justice, but it's part of the development of historic structures if you're not careful. And if you don't have things like historic districts to guide people in how they deal with these things. One of the prettiest and probably by far the most popular style in Victorian era is Queen Anne. And by far the best example that we have, certainly in Emmaus and possibly in the county, is this house at 163 Main. Now, what makes it Queen Anne? Well, Queen Anne was always asymmetrical, and there's always a lot going on. And there's almost always a turret, a wraparound porch. The emphasis is on a lot going on. Again, the materials that are available to you allow you to build in curves. They allow you to make patterns with the materials, patterns in brick, patterns in siding, patterns in shingles. And these guys, these builders and the designers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they had an incredible palette to choose from. Again, things that you could just order, and they arrive in probably a couple of weeks. And those windows in that turret are curved on the second floor. They're curved to match the radius of the turret. That was never possible before the effect that the Industrial Revolution had on machinery, and specifically on glassmaking. The other very handsome Queen Anne building in Emmaus is Dr. Backenstow's house, which is now Wesley Works at 5th and Chestnut. Why is it Queen Anne? Well, it's that turret that makes it Queen Anne. It's a little more sedate. There's not as much material changes going on, but it's Queen Anne. It's got the wraparound porch, a very handsome house. And that reddish brick piece to the right was an addition that was exam rooms for Dr. Backenstow. This is probably taken soon after the house was built. And that's Dr. Backenstow standing there just exactly to the right of the house in front of his carriage. He was apparently a character, and there's more on him shortly. One of what I call sort of a catch-all style within the Victorian era is Italianate. The buildings, like Sweet Memories, tend to be a little more understated. They're not as flamboyant, but they have all the interesting detail that Victorians brought to, like cornices, the detail up underneath that roof overhang. The porch here is simpler, but the windows and the treatment above the window, which they call the hood, is very finely detailed. But the thing is, if you look at this building, forget the porch and forget the details and just look at the mass, you're looking at a colonial building, certainly a colonial-inspired building. It's the same shape as Jacob Ehrenhardt's house, both Jacobs, senior and junior. 3 windows wide. It's just very, very simple. But it's supposedly built in 1871. And then you have the Niemeyer house at 2nd and Main. Another very good example of Italianate just because of its details. Very elaborate front porch and lattice work. Very handsome cornice work under the roof overhang, which you really can't appreciate in that photograph. But the Niemeyer family over the years owned quite a bit of property in Emmaus. But if you go back 150 years, you see this. And this is the same corner. From left to right, in front of those 2 buildings is Main Street, and the street disappearing to the right around that log house is 2nd Street. So that's the original log cabin on the original lot in the original village of Emmaus. And then that building to the left, the red building, that was brick. That's why it's painted red. That's there today. That was built, I think, in 1829 or thereabouts, 1827. And that sign, if you could read that sign in the right side on the pole, you could see that it says Emmaus Inn, Emmaus with one M. So from then on, from the original village until I think the 1930s, that lot was a hotel or an inn and a tavern. So you can bet that with a tavern in the Moravian village, that was watched pretty closely by the elders, because I'm sure they had some issues with what they called tippling at the time. Another not quite as interesting building that was Italianate, it was detailed to be Italianate, but it's hard to recognize, was the Eagle Hotel. The interesting thing about the Eagle Hotel was that it occupied the entire site of what is today the Triangle, the entire tract. The hotel is everything that's white that you see there, and then what you can't see to the left behind it are stables. It was sure a popular destination for people coming in on the railroad. It was successful mostly because of the railroad showing up. The hotel was built in 1850 and the railroad came to Emmaus in 1859. But it was also a point of contention for some people because it occupied the center of what was becoming a very important downtown and commercial center for this growing town. Here's a great picture. The hotel is behind what they call the Victory Arch, which was built here and probably something similar all over the country to celebrate the end of the First World War. And you can see to the left, you're seeing Main Street heading up towards 4th Street, and you're looking at the trolley track. And in the distance, under the left side of that arch, you're seeing the bank building, what was originally called the Emmaus National Bank. And we have a better picture of that later on. But here you're looking in the opposite direction. The hotel's now on your left, and you're still following the trolley tracks. This time you're headed towards Bethlehem. And the very far left is the beginning of the stables. The building to look at here is that arch building next to the tall building. The tall building was what was called the Weaver Building, which was originally the newspaper building. The editor his name was Weaver, John Weaver, I think. And the building to its left was the Palace Theater. Of course, it's no longer there. David's Italian Market is in there now, and of course the arch is gone. The drama is certainly gone. It was an extraordinary feat, and the guy who designed it and built it, his name was John Laudenschlager. Very prolific local builder, also called himself an architect, which at the time he truly was. He went to a correspondence school in Scranton for probably many years and came out of it with pretty deep training in design and particularly drawing. And I know firsthand that he was a very good draftsman because his great-grandson lives in one of his houses, Laudenschlager's houses on North 3rd Street. I couldn't draw as well as he does. He drew most of his drawings in ink. They were just stunning. It's too bad we don't have that building anymore. So the Triangle, now you're looking at a 1925 image of the Triangle Park. You can hardly recognize that it as a park except that there's nothing there to spoil the view of those two buildings. The big one being the Emmaus National Bank. That was 1907. The story behind the Triangle is a good one. And very briefly, Dr. Backenstow, whose house I showed you just a little bit ago, at 5th and Chestnut, was also very, very much tied to the business of Emmaus in addition to having his medical practice. And he was on that board of directors that created that big bank building that you're seeing there. But after that, maybe 15 or so years after that was built, he was interested in, and some friends of his were interested in investing in another bank, also to be located on the Triangle. But he wouldn't build it because of the Eagle Hotel. By the 1920s, it had become a real eyesore. And apparently it looked bad, and I'm guessing it didn't smell too pleasant anymore anyway with those stables. And it was left to get run down, and he wanted the borough to buy the lot, tear it down, and create a park. But they wouldn't agree to do it. There was a money issue. The merchants, surprisingly enough, didn't want it to happen. And he tried for quite a long time to persuade the borough. Finally, he bought it himself, personally, bought the Triangle, bought the hotel, tore it down, and then started the story that he was going to build his new bank on that site and again completely filled the triangle with a new bank. Well, everybody screamed, not the least of which were the board of directors of the Emmaus National Bank, because it would hide their bank from the rest of the downtown. So the borough finally relented and said, well, okay, we'll buy that lot back from you and we'll create a park. And so Back and Stowe sold the land back to the borough at what apparently was a pretty comfortable profit, but with the provision that that lot, that space, never have a building on it, that it would be a park and it would always be a park. We owe him quite a debt because the park there now is used very, very heavily and is really a pretty spot. It makes the town. Second Empire was largely a commercial style. This building is not in Emmaus, by the way. This is Philadelphia City Hall. It's a grand example of Second Empire. Why? Then the why is because those mansard roofs, all those blue roofs that you're seeing there are mansard roofs, and it's basically very simply put there, it's a very, very steep roof to create a big attic. And that was the motive in France where it was developed. And it was the motive here just to copy that style. And it made for a very handsome style. This is probably Emmaus's best version of Second Empire. This is at 5th and Chestnut, what we know as the Wee End building, built, we think, in the 1870s. Why is it Second Empire? Well, it has that classical mansard roof wrapping around the house, but it also has a tower, like a tower effect on the front, which was also common. The hope was that you were trying to create a building that looked tall and possibly taller than it was. So those windows are very tall and narrow. Again, another example of the Victorian style. And this is a photograph of the house, I'm guessing as well, soon after it was built. So you can see it was a lot more elaborate. Those two front porches are just very, very finely detailed. Again, with things that you could buy. It was brick, so you can see some detail of the brick. It was probably very colorful. The shingles on the mansard roof were different colors and different shapes. Another touch that the Victorians used to just sort of embellish the building. This is another really nice, smaller, more modest version on Main Street, just behind the Moravian Church would be to your right. And also, Second Empire, there's the mansard roof. A little more curvy, a little more elegant, but the building is at the same time a little more understated, but all the details are there. And not a very prevalent style, but very handsome. These are sort of similar styles. The National Bank was a good example of the classical revival, just very massive. And as a bank, it needed to say and did say, you know, your money is safe with us. And the detailing was very masculine, very heavy. That roof line, if you get a close-up of that, it's very ornate. Again, all things that you could buy. Now carving stone with machinery, and you could buy these things. And then here's Dr. Back and Stowe's new bank, built in 1923 and facing the triangle without the Eagle Hotel spoiling the view. And it was the modern version, and I emphasize the word modern for the time, the modern version of Greek, sort of an homage to the Greeks with those columns with those Greek capitals on them, but very flat and very sort of severe. That was modern, quote unquote, in Emmaus. The next image this is what was going on in Europe. Slightly different. This was the International Exposition in Barcelona. And this is one of the pavilions, basically just an exhibition hall. This is what they call the international style. Very different from anything we have around here. But, it's an experience. It was a whole different attitude towards architecture. Basically looking forward instead of looking backward is in a nutshell. we go from modern, like ultra modern for that building in Barcelona, and we slip into what for us was the modern era in architecture in this country, which also included arts and crafts, which was really part of it, but you wouldn't know it to look at it. One of the people who's really most important to remember in this area is Frank Lloyd Wright. He was practicing mostly in the Midwest, and this is one of his early houses. Now, it looks complicated, but if you look, just squint your eyes, all you're seeing is a box, and it was probably an almost exactly square box. And it had that hip roof, which is sloping from each direction from the walls of the house, and very deep roof overhangs. But for him, it represented a couple of things. One, it was simple, it was easy to build, which made it potentially an economical house to own. But it was also beginnings of some of his ideas, in the late 1800s, basically now. Beginnings of some of his ideas about long and low and flat looking to sort of engage the landscape, to tie the building into the landscape. This was like an early thought in that direction for him. So when you go in Emmaus, these houses became known as American Four Squares. Four Square was basically a square. It was sort of a four-room plan. It's almost like a circle. It was almost the perfect shape. And again, very easy to build. This was a very good example of the four-square design because it's almost a perfect square. It's brick. It's got very deep roof overhangs, and it's a Sears house. This was ordered out of a catalog. The house showed up on 2nd Street in probably 3 or 4 tractor-trailer loads of materials. And you've hired a builder and you build it. Sears Roebuck. Here's another same idea, but a little more elaborate. Sort of a Spanish influence with this house, a clay tile roof, but at its basics, it's an American four-square. You were going back to like 1894 in that very staid box of a house. Now Frank Lloyd Wright, 35 years later, 40 years later, is doing things like this. This is Fallingwater, probably, if not the most famous, one of the most famous houses in the world. He was experimenting. Those horizontal elements there are porches, and they were what you call cantilevered, and cantilevered very far. He was really pushing the limits of structural design, but he was creating an environment in that house, basically tucked into the woods, built purposely on top of a stream. He was way ahead of his time. And if you look at what his time looked like, the rest of the country, you're seeing the downtown of what in this case is St. Louis, but most center cities look like this. That house and that design and those attitudes towards architecture don't much match what you're seeing in this photograph. You've got smog, and you've got a lot of cars, a lot of traffic, you've got a trolley, and then Frank Lloyd Wright meantime is sort of playing in the Pennsylvania woods with a contemporary notion of architecture. So the modern era also contains what we call arts and crafts. It's interesting because now you have a style that's the complete reverse of Victorian. Victorian is leaning entirely on machine-made products, things that you could get out of a factory. Arts and crafts was saying, no, that's not humane. That doesn't relate to the common man. What relates to people is things that are handmade, things that are designed, lots of natural wood, very cozy, very human scale, which was what Frank Lloyd Wright was concentrating on. And this just happens to be a really good example of what we call the craftsman bungalow. What makes this a bungalow is the very deep roof overhangs, sort of a combination of gable roofs tied together. Those tapered wood columns, which are now square, they're no longer round. They're tapered for look, not for an optical illusion. But there's a couple good houses in Emmaus. This was 160 Main. It's also a bungalow, but a little more sedate, but has all the ingredients, the very deep overhangs. This one has a tile roof, which was common in this part of the country. There's some brackets holding the roof overhangs up. That was also a craftsman touch. One of the better examples in town is, I unfortunately took this photograph in the winter. That's also a clay tile roof. It's red. It's another version of a craftsman bungalow, very simplified. Basically a box with a steep roof and an attic and a big dormer out front to gain second floor space. But it's a very nice example, very rich in detail on the inside. It has art glass. It's a good example of the craftsman bungalow, and also a good example of what became the model for a lot of houses in the 40s and 50s. And so when you drive around Emmaus, you'll see a lot of these. This is basically the same house, but a little more quiet, more contemporary version of materials. These are everywhere. These and this four squares. Drive up and down the streets on the north side of Main Street, and you'll just come upon dozens of these things. Just very comfortable house to live in, economical to build, economical to maintain, easy to heat. They caught fire, just like the four square did. So truly modern, which is basically today, although some of these slides won't say that. You have Frank Lloyd Wright again playing. Now, 1909, hardly modern. I mean, the country is still stuck in Victorian style and, in gargoyles and gingerbread. Frank Lloyd Wright's going clearly in the opposite direction, but now he's really having fun. He's not worried about budget, clearly, with this house. He's thinking about the Midwest and the prairie and tying this house to the ground. So it's very, very long, very narrow. Again, a stunning house. A good example of what Wright was doing in the Midwest was happening here to a small degree. And this is the building at the corner of Harrison and Macungie Avenue. And it's now a doctor's building. I think maybe it has always been a doctor's building. But it's a good example of what became, for Frank Lloyd Wright, the prairie style, which was, that horizontal look. Very deep overhangs, not real steep roofs, sort of the building stretching out to anchor itself to the site. This next house doesn't so much belong in the slideshow, certainly not at this position, but it's Tudor, and I just have a thing for English Tudor. It's just handsome. It's an estate. Very nicely done, very medieval looking, and actually one of the prevalent styles in these revivals, probably more prevalent in the 1930s. Drive around the northern suburbs of Reading and you can see a lot of things like this. This is modern with a capital M, capital O, capital D. It's just somebody, an architect, just having a good time. I think the idea originally was that those beams coming out, those horizontals coming out of the roof, were meant to say to you, well, this is what's holding up the house, which probably wasn't true. It was probably just somebody having fun. And my guess is it's fun to live there as well. And that's modern. But Emmaus has what I consider the crowning jewel in modern, and that's St. Anne's Church. This is a very elegant, actually very simple little building, but it makes just a wonderful statement. And the architect was John Michael, who, believe it or not, was an authority on classical architecture, Greek architecture history. He was a student of history. And he and I did the actual physical walking tours for many years together. But this is what he was doing to have fun. And it's a jewel. So that pretty much wraps it up for me, for my story here. In addition, I think to thanking the Society for inviting me here, one thing to remember that's kind of fun to do is when you're driving around, look for details, slow down. There are a lot of houses in Emmaus that it helps if you slow down and rubberneck a little bit. And and when you're downtown, in Allentown or Bethlehem, be conscious of looking up because a lot of the original handsome architecture of commercial buildings, downtown buildings, is from the second floor on up. First floors get altered for some reason, trying to draw in maybe shoppers or business people, but a lot of the real intact original architecture is evident above your line of sight. So you have to keep your eyes open. But yeah, my best advice is to drive around and start looking at things. Well, how do things relate? That house looks like the other one, but that other one looks older, and they're probably the same style, a newer version. And slow down and look for the details. Look for different kinds of glass, art glass, leaded glass. The more you stare, the more you see. So that's my parting suggestion. But thanks for having me.